What's up, my numbugs? It's the ELESTRALS here, and with the avalanche of Frostfall coming in the very near future, we wanted to give you an idea of what might be coming in the near future with our upcoming meta.
So yeah, with Frostfall around the corner, there are a lot of new decks that are viable in the game, and we're going to be putting them all on a tier list. We've been testing, we've been in the kitchen, we've been cooking up, we've actually been streaming right here on the ELESTRALS channel on YouTube. If you've been missing out, you should definitely tune in. But we've been testing a bunch of these new decks, as well as some of the old decks with the new tools that they've gained, in order to see which decks are top tier and which decks are kind of shitters. So here we're going to be basically giving you guys a rundown of how our testing's been and what decks we think are going to be at the top of the meta this coming format, and which decks will not.
So to kick it off, we have a deck that people have been talking about in the Discord, and that is Funglow Brontiglow Thunder deck.
Yeah, so the Brontiglow deck genuinely is just, the Brontiglow deck is genuinely not great. It's basically watered down Thunder Nexus, and there are better versions of Thunder out there. So we've decided here at the Knots channel, we've elected to put this one in the non-competitive category, just because we believe not that the Brontiglow engine is non-competitive, but building around Brontiglow as a main, like, core of the deck just isn't that good, as opposed to maybe side decking it in certain very specific scenarios where you could basically just have it in your Thunder Nexus deck to swap around should you need it. So we think as a deck, it's not great. As an engine, it has potential. Hey, Swolax, look, it's the Bears. What do you want to say about the Bears?
The Bears!
I love Bears!
Incredible handoff there.
My dearly beloved. I've awakened like a sleeper agent. But unfortunately, I'll be sleeping on this deck in the non-competitive category. All the new tools are really cool. You know, HR talked about them in a box break recently. Like all the new stuff people are really excited about. But unfortunately, they're just not strong enough compared to, you know, effectively our list of Thunder Bears, which is still kind of the best way to play. So new stuff really cool, but not good enough to really break the ice here.
Speaking of decks that you like, we got Fives up next. How do you feel about that?
I'll talk about Fives just a little bit. We're going to put Fives inside of the Rogue category. Now, a little bit of a stipulation on Fives, because Fives effectively just changes into sixes or the big beaters of Frostfall. You know, we get things like Moss Station, even like Arcturus is kind of a consideration if you want to run Insano Spirit Math. But it's a really interesting deck because it is really slow, but I don't know. You might be able to steal a few wins based off of the lower end meta contenders.
On the note of beaters, we have the Earth Beater deck, which was S tier on our last tier list. It was the deck that we consider to be the best deck of base set, going toe to toe with the Thunder Nexus strategy. But post Frostfall, I'm going to be putting this one as a meta contender, but I do not think it remains a top tier deck. And the primary reason why is because the majority of the decks that we find to end up being top tier are decks that actually got a lot of new good tools in Frostfall, and Earth, unfortunately, didn't get any. Paleoth falls short in terms of a searcher. Rummagem remains the best searcher for the deck. Cards like the Cyanectar and the Wasp Ivy, those cards are not fantastic for the Earth deck because they require a little bit too much specific setup in order to get any value off of it. And then you got cards like Cyprong, which are only really good if you're already winning. So in all honesty, none of the new Earth tools really slot into the Earth Beater deck really well. The only good new Earth cards that we got are the Ambrosia, the new Fruit cards, which frankly don't really buff up the Earth Beater deck, but they do buff up the Fruit deck, which we will be talking about in a little bit. And then after that, we got Flammomoth, and Flammomoth is in such a weird place. This is such a weird deck to me because the card, if you read Flammomoth, reads insane. You look at this card, you're like, this card's nuts. It's actually like a crazy card. But getting to it is really difficult, and any deck that's built to turbo out Flammomoth needs very specific 3-card combos to get it. So because the deck is very inconsistent and the odds of you actually getting to the Flammomoth are very low, this deck will fall under the non-competitive category as well, just because you're not able to get to that Flammomoth very often. Trust me, if you get to it, odds are you're going to be winning that game, but getting to it is way too difficult to get any sort of value off of this deck.
I feel like it's kind of similar in concept to like how Voltempest, if you get there, you instantly win. But Voltempest is way easier and requires less setup and is just like an insane card. But more insane.
Hey Josh, you want to talk to us about penguins? I'd love to hear Josh tell us about penguins.
Bro, I love penguins. Why are they so bad? They're so bad. So if it's pretty obvious we're putting this in the non-competitive category, it's so much investment for a great payoff, by the way. I mean, being able to just nuke your opponent's board is a fantastic effect, but having to disenchant 3 from your field is really costly, especially when you have to soak all of your spirits into one big guy when Gorgons just kind of ends the game. This could be splashed a little bit into Thunder Nexus, so there is a little bit of potential there, but as like, if I play Thunder Nexus, I'm not going to want to siphon everything into one card if something happens to it. So that's probably why it's going to be non-competitive. It is a really fun deck. Still try it out, but it's a pooper. It's a stinky.
It is a stinky pooper.
I'd be more curious to see what people do with these cards as like maybe tools in other decks than its own dedicated deck, honestly.
Yeah.
Because the fact that Snowwaddle can search the Frost, Thunder type as itself, that kind of opens it up to maybe future ELESTRALs being worth it. But right now, the only 2 we have are still also not very strong.
On the note of shitters, next up we have the Fire Ascension deck that utilizes Exalt Flare. I'm going to be real with you, this deck is not fantastic. I think Exalt Flare is a card that currently does not have a lot of payoff, but I think it is a card that has potential down the line. I think the biggest thing that, you know, holds back the Exalt Flare card from having a lot of good value is that there are not many 2-drops or 3-drops that you want to go into it with, and Fire also has the downside of having only Hephaestus as a Divine Rune, which is not a very good card in general. So oftentimes you don't want to have to run, you don't want to have to run Hephaestus and things because there's no real good artifacts to search off it, and then the Hephaestus just ends up being a Nexus bank, whereas, you know, decks like Thunder Nexus or like Earth can utilize an actually good Divine Rune in order to get value off the Divine Rune and off Nexusing with it. So for that reason, we are going to be placing the Fire Ascension deck at a non-competitive level.
Oh, Josh, you gotta talk about
I can talk about Haboofin. This is a weird one. Because the deck reads really good. Being able, like, especially the card Sandstorm, being able to turn everything to defense or bounce stuff back to the hand is a very powerful card. But in practice, this deck is very expensive. It uses a lot of spirits for a very little payoff. In practice, it gets destroyed by a lot of the meta decks we haven't even really talked about yet. It can't keep up compared to other Wind versions of the decks, like Wind Nexus or even Pantera for that matter. So for that reason alone, although I just talked a ton of shit on this, I am going to put it in Rogue because it's okay. It has some potential. If you are able to resolve Fin Dust and you are able to resolve Tower of Winds, just like the Flamemoth deck, this does have some more utility than that version of Wind, but still not the greatest.
I'm noticing we haven't talked about very many top tier decks just yet. Should we talk about the first deck that we're putting up in there?
I'm so ready. Go ahead and lock in Lockagon at top tier. I'm so
fantastic
ready.
deck.
I've been loving this deck. We've been running an interesting build. Again, ratios aren't quite solidified yet, so not quite sure on if it's better with something like an engine with Aephros and like a draw engine where you're just nexusing a bunch of cards and healing and popping, or just going for a straight Rise from the Depths build where you're consistently like reviving cards from your underworld to heal and then pop cards with Lockagon. Very similar to how Wirtz plays Fruit with Rise from the Ashes to gain advantage. This deck not only has an improved stall game, like Little Guy before it, but it has like an odd like Krakatuka pressure because Lockagon is huge and also represents like a pop at any moment because you can just sit on your Ambrosias. I think as far as like weaknesses for this deck, it has an interesting matchup into Morfrost, which we'll talk about here in a second, and also has like Thunder Nexus can sometimes really screw over this deck, especially if you can get the Spark at Rip to hit the right card. That's going to be kind of problematic. But overall, we're looking at this deck for a top tier contender in the upcoming meta.
Yeah, Spark could definitely do be a card that we have to deal with.
Because they get away with it.
They can't get away with it. I mean, speaking of the Latagon, the Lockagon, they're brothers. We got the Fruit deck up next. How does the Fruit deck contend in the meta?
We'll go back and forth this. Okay, so unlike Lockagon, its water counterpart, the Latagon and the Fruit, we'll put in meta contender. So far, we're still in the process of testing. We've seen pretty solid performances from Wirtz in a live stream recently. I've been testing this deck a little bit too. And this deck has a lot of crazy stuff. The new card Cornucopia, and the new Ambrosia form Cornucopia, really does add more consistency to when you just go Jotaya Pass, right? and also makes Drataya something to actually worry about. You know, and oftentimes we see that Gorgon's Gaze is getting put on a Drataya, which never seems worth it, but you really don't want them to draw into their massive advantage because they just get everything you need. And on the back half, you're playing regular Earth Beatdown, which, like we said, is a meta contender in itself. So you just get meta contender Earth Beatdown with a better draw engine. I will say, though, sometimes, and this is kind of why it's a meta contender, not top tier, you can just draw a bunch of cards, but to what end? What are they really doing? So still waiting to see tangible results, but much, much better placement than last set.
Yeah, I think my big POV on this deck is the fact that it has the opportunity to just snowball like crazy very quickly, but it also just has the opportunity to get Gorgons on a Drataya and end on no card advantage and then just be very outpaced very quickly, which is very unfortunate. It really is just like one of those decks that just has to high roll to win. Next up, we got the Krakatuga, the one and
Speaking
only.
of decks that need to high roll to win. So Krakatuga, you know, a very, very threatening deck throughout set 1. We're going to slot in here at meta contender. And the reason for that is doesn't really get a lot of new tools that the deck really wants to be using, and the game plan really hasn't changed. The only difference is that your Krakatuga wants to stick around, wants to draw games out, and eventually just burn your opponent to death with a couple eruptions. Krakatuga tossed in there somewhere as well. And the game is just getting faster. We're seeing that it's a lot easier to put pressure on board, and the strength of Krakatuga was it could just sit behind like a small Tuga or two or a Necroff and just kind of be like, hey, I'm here, and you're gonna just explode in a couple of turns because I drew all 3 eruption. And I mean, we're seeing Lockagon, we're seeing like that deck just is never worried about eruption. Really, the only decks, and we'll get to this in a little bit, that really are worried about Krakatuga are Morfrost, because that deck wants to burn through a bunch of resources to get its advantage going. And so if you high roll with Krakatuga, you can just, you know, explode your opponent with your mind. If they're on Morfrost, but otherwise, most of these other decks put up too much pressure, either in the form of guys on field or like Race to the Top having Race to the Top in it. Like you just get your board outed, you can't stall, and so, you know, Krakatuga looks like you can still contend in some way, especially as we continue with best of 1 format for tournaments. But it's just, it didn't get enough to really keep its status as like something that will top consistent.
The other addition being that Lavalith is a card that's going to be in a lot of decks, and so a lot more times you're going to be playing against someone who will have a Fire Enchanted Elestral, meaning that your eruption will only burn for 1 rather than for 3, and that can be the difference between, you know, knocking your opponent out of the game and just doing very little damage to them.
I mean,
yeah,
even one step further than that, like everybody's going to be playing Fire Spirits in their deck at all.
Yeah.
So like you can even disenchant to play around Eruption too.
But speaking of some top tier up and coming decks, not really up and coming, we've known it's been at the top. It's racing to the top. It is Thunder Nexus, specifically focusing heavily around Race to the Top, which is just such an insane card that makes Thunder Nexus just phenomenal. There's now finally a reason to be playing Mount Olympus in the deck. Previously, I had played around within Thunder Nexus because it gets your guys to 5s, pretty good. Now, not only does it make your guys 5s, it also means that Race to the Top just says, all right, I've got an Ass Rabbit, that guy's gonna explode. And you know, you just don't have to worry about board pressure as much. It makes the Spark It hand looping go even crazier, because you can prevent removal from hitting the board, you can remove your opponent's board presence, and you just snowball so hard to a point where in testing, like, it's not uncommon for a Thunder Nexus board, which in set 1, sometimes you got a couple of guys, it's rare for it to really expand wide. Most in testing, I'm like, oh yeah, I've got a full board, I have no space, because I've just accrued so much advantage, and I'm just constantly, you know, casting out guys.
Yeah, one thing that's also a new tool, a couple new tools that this gets, not only in Race to the Top, but also Platypulse, which is kind of worth experimenting with just a little bit, either in the side or in the main. It's, again, one of those things that might just be solid to preference. Platypulse makes it extremely hard to get over your previously very get-overable guys, right? Like, that's something that's going to be interesting.
I think that this deck is also good enough that people will just be siding Race to the Top as well. Because if your opponent's on it, you're just like, all right, yeah, sure, I'll get a free removal spell, thank you.
On the note of Thunder decks, and we talked about this just a little bit when we were talking about Flammoth, is the Voltempest deck. And we're specifically talking about Voltempest Turbo, like the deck that like plays the Griff use, or like really just wants to run out the Volt Tempest under a Zeus as quickly as possible. And the other thing that's really important to keep in mind with this is it does consider if your opponent has Zeus, and because the Thunder deck is, you know, the Race to the Top deck is up there as one of the top contenders, they will also be playing Zeus. So we're putting this at Rogue. I don't think the deck has a very solid place in the meta, but I think it is a deck that you can rock up to a tournament with and then steal some games from time to time. So I think it should be on your radar, to the sense that you should know how to deal with this deck, but I think you shouldn't expect to play against it more so than maybe one round in any given tournament you play at. It is a deck that can steal wins, but I don't think it's a deck that we can expect to see at the top level and performing really well.
I think the crazy thing with the deck too is that the Thunder engine is just so powerful that you'll probably win without Volt Tempest too.
True. Next up, we got the Frost Nexus deck with Shiverroar.
This is a weird one. This deck looks really promising. I'll be honest, this is not a deck that I think any of us have really tested a whole lot. But I see a lot of people talking about it because Shiverroar is a really powerful card, being able to take advantage of using spirits that you've previously used throughout the game and recycling them to your board. I think some of the weaknesses this deck has is that it's not particularly aggressive. A lot of the 1-drops are quite small with Catarant, Frigicup, stuff like that. But the advantage of the deck is that it is able to pump out 2-drops really frequently with cards like Frostics, which I think we all know is an extremely busted card.
Very strong, yeah.
I have a really rough time trying to place this one because I don't have a whole lot of experience testing this, but I think it could be a potential meta contender, just with how easily it's able to get out bigger guys.
On the note of Frost decks, it's time to talk about it. We got some more Frost up in here, boys. We got more Frost. We're so happy to have more Frost. I love this deck. More Frost is a top tier deck. I know a lot of people are very much on the fence when they talk about the More Frost deck. And the More Frost deck has a bunch of different ways to be played. And I think that we have nailed the correct way to play More Frost. I'll let you guys know right now, after this tier list is going to be going up, we're going to be doing deck profile after deck profile, showing you guys how some of the top decks look in our testing. If you guys haven't seen them on our streams, you will be able to see them on the channel here, so make sure you subscribe to see those. But we will have a More Frost deck profile going up in the near future very soon. But the way that we've been playing More Frost is a lot of people play it with the idea that you play it with the Keones and the Terraforms and stuff like that, and you're trying to swarm the board. The way that we've been playing this is we've been playing More Frost as an engine to just get a big beater and load up Frost Spirits in the Underworld in order to get full value off of Cryoling and Cryovern. Being able to go normal Cryoling into a Cryovern to have a 7 beater, you can water enchant it to play it around the Tsunami and stuff like that, means that a bomb plus Cryovern puts so much offensive pressure on the opponent that you put them on a clock really quickly. Opening with a Lycan form basically tells your opponent you have about 4 turns to win the game, otherwise I win the game, is essentially what you're telling your opponent. So because the deck constantly has guys to run out, you're applying so much pressure that the deck is really, really good at just powering through whatever back row your opponent might have. The only downside that the deck has is that it struggles with removal options, so we are playing the Resting on Your Laurels and the Earthquakes in the deck in order to add to those removal options to mitigate the one weakness that we feel the deck has. Other than that, some of the cards are kind of costly, but with the amount of pressure this deck puts up, you run down your opponent's spirits faster than you run down your own. So for that reason, this deck is in top tier for us. We really think that it is a deck that we can see dominate the meta in the near future, and I'm really excited to get to play this. This is probably the deck I'm going to be playing going into the next format.
But Coder, what about Waylance?
Oh my god! I can't wait for them to load my Underworld with all my More Frost so I can normal a bomb and have him have 12 attack! I can't wait!
Anyways,
speaking of Waylance, I'll say it, bro. Waylance is non-competitive. That deck is not good. Don't even bother. That card is not good, and it's not really a deck. We put it on here just because it's a card that people have been talking about. It's not good. Genuinely, like this one deck, I will say this is probably the deck that I look at and I go, there is no point even trying to do anything with this. It's not great.
Yeah, out of the 2-drops that you could be playing in this upcoming format, you're better off with Shiverroar or really the set 1 2-drops, really.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Next up, we got Fire, and I know what you guys are thinking. Coder, ELESTRALS. Wasn't Fire like the worst deck ever in base set? Well, it was, but now Josh is going to tell you why that's no longer the case.
Fire's fire.
It's fire, bro.
It is.
Flames.
We're so bad.
So
We've made it.
we've talked a lot about the existence of Lavalith. We've talked about the existence of Chains. Both of these cards fix a lot of the issues that Fire had as a deck in set 1. To be honest, I mean, I don't know what Fire's game plan even was in set 1. It had nothing. Being able to play two of the most powerful cards in set 2 without having to use your Spirit deck for a bunch of extra fires that you don't need otherwise is very powerful. We see that in Earthquake in the Earth Beaters deck in set 1. The deck did get a lot more consistent. You are playing cards like Astrabbit, but now we also have cards like Comagma, which draw cards and discard cards to add extra consistency. So you're going to see those Lavaliths and those Chains a lot more often. Plus, we get a reason to play Kinleo, which is busted.
I think one thing that makes this deck really strong as well is it does have the ability to go second, unlike some other strategies in this list, where because native Lavalith and also things like Kinleo, which again now have a purpose, you can pretty comfortably say that when you're going second, okay, like I can deal with the board now, opposed to last time or last set where Fire has very little going first or second.
Yeah, I think the one thing that this deck has a weakness with in recent testing is that the guys that you are getting aren't very large. So if you aren't seeing those removal options, or if you're not seeing Lavalith, sometimes it is hard to push through a board if you don't have those removal options. Regardless of that fact, I think this is actually going to be a top tier contender for the upcoming format.
I think I agree, and I think the thing that I like about this deck the most is I think this is the first deck, correct me if I'm wrong, this is the first deck that we've seen that in engine has removal for Elestrals and removal for back row, because Lavalith deals with back row, Kinleo deals with Elestrals, on top of Lavalith being able to just be a big guy that can beat over stuff. You got your Necref to beat over stuff, you play your Forge in order to make your guys bigger and stuff like that. Like, you just have the ability to run out beaters. You know, initially they're very small, but under Forge they get pretty big. But then you have Lavalith for backer removal, and then Kinleo for Elestrals removal. You just have removal options for pretty much anything, so the toolbox gets a lot better.
You have a removal for their Spirit deck too with Eruption.
Yeah,
oh, God.
Remove the Spirit deck. Just delete it. Delete it.
Eruption, right, may be able to remove the Spirit deck, but what if I heal it all the time with the greatest deck ever made? 2 drops. No, it's not the ever made. It's definitely a rogue deck. 2 drop is something that, like, saw some performance in set 1 and something that I really fell in love with towards the end of the first set, but I look at this deck and it's like, if I'm playing this right, I should just be playing Lockagon. There's no reason to play this the way you were playing it in set 1, where it's about stalling to then turbo out some really big 2-drop. In the case where the image here, you can see Sonicore was the big one that most decks played. Sonicore Bag of Winds being like just very difficult to deal with. You start building the deck and you're just ever so inclined to eventually go towards the correct route of just playing Lockagon. So for that reason, 2-drop really is rogue, because if you're playing it, you're just playing a worse version of Lockagon, because you're missing out on a lot of the really good pieces that deck has by trying to stay with set 1 type deck building.
I mean, even to add on to that, Sonicore's a lot easier to out now than it was in set 1.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, Race to the Top just says goodbye. That thing has what, 2 defense? You're just like, you're gone. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
I mean, even just the Elestrals themselves are big enough.
Yeah, you just go, Cryovern? Pew! Goodbye. Bro, yeah. I'm gonna say it. I love Earth cards. I love me some Earth. I'm a big fan of a big Earth enjoyer. This deck is bad. It's not good. And I think this is something it kind of goes in line with like the philosophy of card design in Elestrals. I feel like the way the cards have been designed in the game, there's a bunch of cards that specifically require you to draw other specifically named cards. So in the case of the Cyanectar, you need to specifically have like Poison Tipped Arrow or the Poison Nectar in order to get into the Wasp Ivy, and the odds of drawing that exact combination of cards and then the odds of actually being able to pull off that exact combination of cards is very low. So because of that, the deck is not very consistent. Don't get me wrong, if you get the Wasp Ivy out, card's crazy, card's very good, but will you get there? More often than not, you won't. So for that reason, there's no real reason to be playing this over just playing a consistent Earth deck that does what you want it to do almost every single time. Maybe down the line, but not today. But a deck that is a lot better today is the Wind Toolbox deck. So Wind Toolbox was a deck that we had in base set, and I think it's a deck that will continue to just get better and better and better as new like one-drop Wind ELESTRALs release, because Aeolus lets you search all of them. So while the toolbox gets bigger, it means that the toolbox gets better. The more tools you have in your toolbox, the more you can do. So the two additions that we have are the Galaxair and the Nemesail. Nemesail being able to help circumvent how expensive the wind cards can be. Like your Sorlet, you cast it out with a wind, expend a wind, that's -2 right there in order to out a guy. Or Aeolus, costs 2 to search a guy and stuff like that. If you're able to rack up spirits on your Nemesail, like on cast, and then maybe Altar of Stars to it or something like that, you get to refund a lot of those wind spirits that you're using in order to cast stuff. And for that reason, the deck has gotten a little bit better. We still don't think that it's top tier, but we do think it is a meta contender. If you are trying to play some amount of like wind control with the new toolbox options that you have, Galaxair being really good at outing stuff just as much as Sorlet is, I think the deck does have a pretty decent place in the meta. It does need a little bit more testing, figuring out like ratios, how many Pigus you want to play, how many Nemesail you want to play. But I think once you hit that sweet spot with the ratios and you figure out exactly how many of each you want to be playing, I think the deck will have a pretty decent spot in the meta. So currently, I think it's up there. I'm excited to see if it goes up or down on our tier list later down the line. But for now, it's a meta contender. It's a deck that's decent. It's a good deck. And last but not least, Josh, tell us about your boy.
Oh, my boy Pantera. I'm a huge Pent enjoyer, and I do think that this deck is okay-ish going to the Frostfall format. I think one thing that this deck does have a huge advantage going into Frostfall is the fact that you are going to be able to summon your Pantera a lot more often, just because a lot of the ELESTRALs are bigger. I think one of the issues about getting to Pantera before was, unless your opponent was playing a lot of 5s, you weren't really going to get the big guy out in the first place. But now with cards like Lavalith and a lot of other bigger ELESTRALs, you're going to be summoning the dragon himself every single game. There are a couple things that have been fixed about the deck, though, too, like the inclusion of Nemesail for Wind Nexus. You're not going to be spending nearly as many spirits, or you are going to be able to recover those spirits more often. But the other issue, too, is that there's a lot more removal in Frostfall, too. So decks like Race to the Top Thunder, and it already had a bad Thunder matchup before, is going to have a really hard time with this, and any defensive strategies like Lockagon are going to run it into the ground. And I think it's going to have a bad Morfrost matchup, too, which is why I'm going to put this in the Rogue category, even though I love this deck.
Yeah, I think one thing to consider about the Pantera deck specifically is, like, you look at decks like the Lockagon deck and stuff like that, they want to put guys in defense. And what do you do? What are you going to do? You're going to run a Hydrake into a big dude with a huge defense? Good luck.
Yeah.
That's not going to get you anywhere. So this is what our tier list is looking like for the Frostfall format. Let us know. Do you guys think we got it right? Do you guys think we got it wrong? Tell us that we're dumb. Coder, Morfrost is not top tier. It's Rogue tier. Coder, Imperawatt is the best card ever made. Slap that one in top tier. Do it immediately, right now. We want to know what you guys think. Let us know in the comment section below what decks you will be playing in the Frostfall format and what decks you want us to showcase on our streams or in our deck profiles or in our videos and stuff like that. We are going to be grinding them out. We're going to be running out essentially deck profiles for the top tier and the meta contender deck. So all these 9 decks that you see up here, expect to see deck profiles for all 9 of those decks on our channel in the near future. We're going to be running those out very shortly. But with that being said, guys, any last words before we close this one out?
Look, I got this deck! Let's go! Let's go!
All right, so with that being said, make sure you guys comment, like, and subscribe, and we'll see you on the next live stream or in the next video. Have a good one, y'all, and peace!